All right, for our next interview, I want to bring on Robbie to talk about the future of on-chain gaming. So please join me in welcoming Robbie on stage. So thank you for joining us. You're also another Australian native here, and we want to kind of cover everything that's happening in crypto in this region. So my first kind of question to you is just tell us about how Immutable got started. And you've kind of had a journey of trying a few things and kind of getting to where you are now. We would love to kind of set the stage by letting everybody else know too.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much for having me. So I'm Robbie. I'm the co-founder of Immutable. We are the leading Web3 gaming platform globally. We have 330 games building on us. We've raised close to $500 million by now from Temasek, Tencent, and other funds. We obviously work with the foundation which creates the IMX token, which is around the 35th largest token in the world today. And our vision is very simple. We think there are going to be more users onboarded by games in the next 2 years than every other application live on blockchain combined. And the utility of those use cases are going to be some of the clearest and some of the most that are uniquely enabled by blockchain technology. So how we got started, I've been in Bitcoin since 2014. My brother got into it in San Francisco. We thought it was kind of interesting, but honestly, we also thought it was kind of silly. We didn't really see the major value. When Ethereum came out, we became obsessed. And that was because you could write smart contracts, you could actually play and interact with applications. And I remember, did anyone here raise your hand if you used Etherroll back in the day? A few hands. Basically, it was a smart contract gambling game where you would roll a die and it would probabilistically return to you a reward based on the outcome of that dice. Very, very simple game. But there are slot machines in Australia where between $2 to $3 billion is spent by the government annually on heuristically verifying that these machines are paying out what they say they're paying out, 88 to 92 cents, that they have the sufficient reserves. And all of this was rendered redundant through a smart contract version of this that was 200 lines long. And so it was pretty obvious that this would become the financial backend to everything. And then the application did something that the government could never do, which is they took the profit streams or the revenues of this application and they gave it to every user joining the application, aka the first co-op for gambling. And I became obsessed with this idea of, hey, you can actually have a brand new form of capitalism using the same incentives, but using a much more effective distribution mechanism, which is bootstrapping by giving pieces of the network to every one of your first users. And so we built trading bots for a few years, and in 2017, we were building, I think it was called the Distributed Autonomous Bank, or DAB, effectively a compound competitor for Compound. It was a lending protocol. We were about to launch it when the first ever NFT came out, which was a CryptoPunk. And we saw these and we said, this will be the first breakout application when you apply it to gaming. And back then it was about 80 billion, now it's 150 billion US dollars that is spent on in-game items every year. So this is not the ability to play Roblox or Call of Duty. This is literally the skins inside of Fortnite. I feel like I'm speaking to an audience that will get this. But that market has grown 10% year on year, and gaming is now bigger than music, movies, and TV combined. And when a gamer buys a Fortnite skin or when they buy a coin in Candy Crush, they get 0 rights. They get a line in a database, even when some level of gray marketplace is enabled, like if we have any Counter-Strike Go fans in the room, the $15 billion traded every year of CSGO skins is completely at the impunity, at the beck and call of what Steam or Valve decides to change the rules every year. And so we thought there was a much better way. We started by building the first ever on-chain game called Etherbots. You can play a round of it today. It'll cost you hundreds of dollars in gas fees. I don't recommend it. We sort of were at the break point of Ethereum scaling back in 2017-18. And we quickly realized we had to build a platform that made it simple for everyone else too. And so Immutable today does a bunch of things, but really it comes down to how do you make it incredibly easy to build a real money economy and a Web3 game, and how do we make it incredibly easy for people to play a Web3 game. We have obviously Immutable ZK-VM, Immutable X, we have our wallet, we have our global order book, SDKs. There's a whole ton of stuff that kind of goes into that.
That's awesome. Maybe one thing I'd also be curious about is what's that same timeline look like for a game publisher or studio? How kind of have they evolved their thinking from 5 years ago where they thought everything is a scam in crypto and we don't want to touch it, to you now working with some of the biggest ones? And what was kind of that moment for them?
Yeah, it's interesting. It was kind of, there was an idyllic...
It was definitely...
yeah, there was an idyllic period before anyone had heard of NFTs where I remember Gods Unchained, which was our second game, went to the top of the gaming subreddit of all time. And this was because we took a sort of, we supported some Blitzstrong during the moment of controversy, if people recall that, due to, just supporting gamer rights. And the reaction towards digital ownership was incredibly positive. People were saying, like, how cool is this? It's an alternative to, the exploitative current model. And then, of course, the branding issue with NFTs came. I think we've matured a lot, and how studios are thinking about it now, I would split into West versus East. So Asia is definitely full-on Web3 gaming. You have, in South Korea, pretty much every one of the largest gaming companies of the world having a very active strategy where they're doing 9-figure budgets to create Web3 games. You have Krafton creating Migaloo, which is a Roblox competitor with a 9-figure budget. You have Nexon creating a Web3 game. You have a huge bunch of indie and mid-sized studios. In China, the #1 outsourced game development today, where they're trying to distribute it beyond China, are Web3 games, because you can't deploy it locally, but you can to an international audience. So it's sort of taken over, I think, very virulently, and part of that is the reaction towards digital ownership is very positive in Asia, and they're used to paying for things in games. There's none of that branding issue. In the West, it's definitely taken off, but often it's at the C level of these games companies, and they have to get the game studios on board. And so it's classic innovator's dilemma. We see the most active successes in the next 2 years are going to be mid-sized studios with $10 million to $200 million in funding who are going all in on leveraging Web3 so they can take down huge incumbents. Games like Illuvium, which is also Sydney-based, with 9 figures in funding. Games like Space Nation, games where people are leveraging the assets and distribution of Web3 to be more successful. That being said, we engage with, we've mapped around 40 AAA studios, I guess you could call them. 39 of them are open to Web3. 21 of them have active projects or initiatives. So the reaction is quite positive. Really, it just comes down to what we call like the FarmVille moment. If you look at the history of gaming, there's been 3 major shifts in distribution. You had the shift to social gaming, you had the shift to mobile gaming, and the shift to free-to-play gaming, which was a lot of a horizontal that underpinned all of that. Each of those distributions only became popular when someone created a hit game that showed how everyone else could clone it. On Facebook, when you had the shift to the social graph leveraged gaming, FarmVille was the first game where everyone figured out, oh, this is exactly how you can encourage your friends to join the game by making rewards or poking depending on whether your friend helped you farm a cow or something. I don't know, I'm butchering terms here. But as soon as that came out, people cloned hundreds of copies, and it became very easy to build a hit game with this model. We still haven't had that moment for Web3, because the only thing that came close ended up being an unsustainable economy. What we're really focusing on is how do we have this boilerplate Web3 game with real ownership where everyone can easily clone the underlying structure and create a successful game. And eventually there'll be a point in our thesis where gamers will demand ownership and they won't play things that don't provide it to them. And that's how you'll be able to get the entire industry on board.
That's actually, thank you for that amazing answer. I think that's like a super comprehensive view of how that's evolved and kind of where we are. My kind of obvious question is, we kind of see different versions of the pitch for like why you should have a Web3 game, or why should a game have Web3 elements. What is kind of your answer to that question? Like, what exactly is it that you are compromising on or not compromising on if something is more tied to a digital asset?
So in my view, people always talk about askew-morphic versus skew-morphic, on-chain native games. I think it's simpler than that. It just comes down to, do people want to play it, and is the value they experience through Web3 significantly more? And right now, I think the clearest use case is people are spending $150 billion on in-game items that they can never sell again. And we have an opportunity to turn that into open economies where they can sell them later on, and you can have emergent third-party financial infrastructure, institutions, Goldman Sachs trading desks, trading futures for Fortnite skins in 5 or 10 years. This is the most obvious application because we have this huge spot market where people can't sell. And in every example where they've had some gray market, some allowance to have tradability, people go crazy. There's $15 billion traded of Counter-Strike Go skins every year. In Magic the Gathering, there's an estimated secondary market cap in the billions of dollars of cards, but every year they have to monetize by creating $30 to $50 million worth of new cards and deprecating the value of old cards in order to make them more attractive. There's a much better business model there. It's where you take fees every time the economy trades, and suddenly the incentive of the developer is aligned with the incentive of the players, which is to grow the economy over the time, grow utility. And that was what, I guess at its core, what excited me is the ability to align incentives between the issuer of assets and between the buyer, which has always been in tension between any primary controlled issuance, aka fiat asset in the history of the world. There's certainly more complex things. It comes down to games succeed or die based on acquisition, retention, and monetization. How much does it cost to get users into your game? How much will they stick around? How much do they spend? And we think we can improve all of these stats drastically while making a much better incentive alignment. Your acquisition costs plummet if you can get a piece of the game by signing up. So that's really share to earn. That's the advantage of tokens and UA, driven by those token balances, which we've seen emerge over the last year. Retention. Players stick around far longer. We found 2 to 3x longer when they have assets involved in the underlying game because they, again, have skin in the game. And third, which is monetization, the question I always ask is how much would you spend on a house if you could never sell that house? You would spend something. You would spend some, future discounted cash flow of not paying rent, but you would not pay the millions of dollars, certainly that Sydney has seen real estate prices climb to in recent years. And so I think fundamentally it comes down to those three. From that, you could argue that on-chain gaming is going to be really exciting, that, hey, we just want real money economies and the logic itself. I personally think full logic of complicated games on-chain does not make sense based on either scaling requirements or decentralization requirements right now, but obviously that could change.
Maybe with one small exception of anything that kind of requires randomness, where that it can't be biased. So any lottery type or gambling type behaviors, I'd rather take the on-chain version than an off-chain. But that's totally fair. So jumping kind of back to Immutable, there's a lot of things that you've been doing over the last few months, and there's been a lot of already cool announcements. And I want to kind of focus on each of those and just going to have you share what have been some of the cool things. So what I want to start off with is understanding what is Immutable Passport and what kind of led you to launch that.
So Immutable Passport is our wallet. It is designed to onboard the next billion players. A lot of people say that, but I think we've really got a user experience that's finally getting to the point where you don't have 99.99% of people quit if you try and acquire them from a traditional acquisition source. And basically, it's a fully self-custodial wallet that you can sign in with email or with Google or with iOS. And under the hood, the architecture is a smart contract wallet that uses a dual multi-sig where we act as the co-signatory. The other key innovation is most easy-to-use wallets either compromise on custody, which we never want to do. That's one of the fundamental principles that we built the organization with. Why we built from Ethereum from day one is decentralization and security mattered a lot to us. There's no point in trying to build a brand new trillion-dollar asset class if at the end of the day it's still owned by databases and servers that can rug you or that can have security breaches. So that was incredibly important to us. But the second thing is it has to be extremely usable for games and gamers. If you deposit $10, you should be able to use that $10 on every single game, no matter what wallet or what game you're playing on. And most custodial approaches actually fragment your liquidity per deposit per game, which creates a terrible user experience. Imagine trying to pay IAP inside of an app you downloaded, Candy Crush, and every single time you want to pay, you have to re-register your credit card, redeposit funds, and sign up. Your consumer conversion is going to plummet. So those are the kind of two major innovations. We've actually had I believe 250,000 signups in the last week on Passport, a lot driven by Alluvium and by Coyote, and I think we're nearly at 1 million wallets, and we were only at 400,000 6 weeks ago. So it's been sort of a big ramp.
Yeah, I'm not a scientist, but I think that's good.
It's good ramp. Yeah.
How kind of do you think about, I think, I don't disagree with anything you said, but the thing I'm kind of still interested in asking is, how do you think about the time it takes for you to now maintain a separate service that may or may not be core to the chain that you're building, and does that fit within the engineering scope and the product scope of things, or do you think this is like you had to do it because nobody else was, or you think that is actually the only way you can do this?
Great question. We spend a lot of time thinking about where do we want to play in the stack, because I think this is the least thought about. People generally optimize. The cynical version would be to maximize for how much you can raise from VCs and how much your token is going to be worth. The more generous version is a lot of people want to build networks that other people can use, and it's unclear where value is going to accrue in the long term. Where we want to play is we think there are very few people thinking about how can you build successfully in one spot without having to worry about a million different things, and also how do you create a great developer experience and a great user experience. Ultimately, we don't want to build blockchain scaling technology. That requires 300 PhDs. It's basically a company all in itself. That's why we partner with people like Polygon for their ZK-VM tech. What we want to build is everything required to create that good developer or end user experience and thriving liquidity. The wallet for us, there was no good solution in market, but also vertical integration allows us to do things that you can't do if you just own one piece of the stack. I'll give you a good example. Obviously, cross-rollup liquidity and a multi-rollup future is incredibly important. Even Immutable ZK-VM will struggle to support more than 3 to 5 hit games. The future has to be multi-rollup. And either each of those rollups can be islands, where user funds are fragmented, where games make less money, where users get poorer prices, and we're basically just building a whole bunch of L2s or L3s. Or it can feel like unified state, where you can trade an asset on one chain or rollup and you can buy it on another. And what Passport allows us to do is, by having us be the primary user experience, we can do things like under the hood. As soon as a user bids on an immutable order on another rollup supported by Immutable, sort of simultaneously and atomically lock down bids on that asset, securely bridge funds over and transact it. So those things are very difficult to accomplish in one transaction or one user experience without vertical integration. The same thing goes for how we think about the rest of the stack, really.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I had a follow-up, but I think that's just like now a personal curiosity, so I'll refrain from asking that on stage. Let's talk about kind of the Polygon side of things. So you mentioned that you kind of are transitioning to the ZK-VM. What made you kind of do that transition, and what does that actually enable now? So
we've always thought that ZK is the future of scaling. The only ZK technology that was available when we made that bet was Starkware. And I mean, they're fantastic engineers. I think they have some of the best ZK tech around. Certainly it was the first in production. But ultimately, that was app specific. It didn't have smart contracts. If you wanted to drag and drop an L1 contract from Ethereum, you couldn't. And that was incredibly important for us from a tech perspective. And the other reason was simply commercial. 15 months ago, gaming was really split into 40% of market share was at Polygon, 40% with Immutable, and we thought it was incredibly silly because we're both at different layers of the stack. Why don't we unify forces? Why don't we work together? And why don't we build with their tech at the scaling layer? And since that partnership, I mean, our win rate is now approaching 80% for the last 6 months. We've gone from 100 games at the start of last year to 340 today, and a lot of those in the last 6 months. So I think just from a commercial perspective, it's solved a lot of the dilemma for games.
Oh, so just to check, these are all already default Polygon ZK-VM games?
These are ones we won together jointly.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that solved, games we heard consistently, we have no idea where we want to build, we hear X, Y, Z, and we thought, why don't we just create a default platform where it's very easy. If a Web3 game developer wants to build, they know to build on this unified stack.
Amazing. Is it a good way to think about these games now behaving like app-specific chains? Because if I understand the aggregation layer, effectively every game will be its own universe. Does that simplify things, or does that complicate things? What kind of the nuances of this world?
Yeah, I think every game, probably not necessary. I think big games, yes. And even gaming platforms. And a lot of gaming platforms are built on Immutable. They'll want their own chain, they'll want their own native asset, etc. And so, I expect there to be 5 to 10 probably by the end of the year. over time, over the next 3 years, probably closer to the 200 mark as you get more and more hit games, and each of them will likely want their own. But I still think there'll be many hubs of many games and also big default chains as well. So, a typical pattern I would expect is a game builds on, say, a default chain like Immutable ZK-VM. They get to 10 million users. They're like, we really need our own space right now. We're sort of crowded, and they decide to upgrade.
Oh, interesting. So they're not multiple ZK VMs on Immutable. This will be a full-on spin-out, but on the aggregation layer.
Yeah, I would still say it's on the Immutable platform.
I see.
Exactly.
Which implies kind of your contract and kind of the universe that they're
cross-roll liquidity, etc., passport. Yeah. So our vision is you should be able to trade any asset on any Immutable supported rollup in any denomination of currency in any marketplace with the global order book. All of that should be atomically matchable. And I think that's resolving one of the biggest Achilles heels of not just blockchain, but NFT liquidity more broadly today. At the end of the day, what we're trying to build is, like, NFTs as an asset class have been horrendously misnomered by, some of the brands they've been associated with, by a lot of the things we've seen over the last 4 years. All they are is taking the fundamental value proposition of digital ownership, the same thing Bitcoin pioneered, and allowing it to apply to any form of unique value. And there is 100 times more unique value in the world than non-unique value. There's $400 trillion worth of homes. It's the largest asset class in the world. And we think our thesis in the long run, digital ownership won't be the driver, but superior liquidity and superior financial utility will be. And you're going to get both of those things if assets live on chain. Because fees get compressed to zero, because finance is open and modular, and you're going to get, people vampire attacking people until everyone owns the majority of the networks today that are owned by BlackRock, etc.
That'll be a pretty interesting world.
Longer term vision.
It might be sooner than we think. Switching gears to kind of the company building side, what would you say has been some of the biggest learnings you've had? Obviously, there's a very different. I mean, you can interpret this in multiple ways. You've been trying to do this thing for a handful of years. There's a constant battle with kind of convincing people to kind of care about this as a category, to just scaling up the business. What would you say has been the biggest learning lesson there?
There are so many lessons that we have learned building a company to, we've got 260 full-time, we've got another 100 contracting to build the games. So, one of the more sizable teams, we're not Coinbase, but, we're sort of more than most teams. I think talent density is incredibly important, just bringing on board the best people. We're in a privileged position where we can sort of, get the best people in Australia, which is pretty awesome. And I think we're, if you want to work in Web3, we're one of the more exciting places. I would say controversially, we often try and hire Web 2 talent and who is keen about Web 3 and bring them in. That's not for every role. A lot of engineering roles, they need to have sort of specific domain expertise, but the reality is there's just not enough talent in Web 3 for us to always be able to get the people or the scale or the talent we want. And so that approach has actually worked quite effectively. The other thing is just building a Web 3 company in some ways is very different. It's a lot faster paced. The strategy, I think, is quite complex, but in some ways it's very similar to just building a successful tech company. And so all the same principles apply. If anyone here is building a business, number one resource I'd recommend is The Great CEO Within, which is written by Matt Mokery, which is actually Brian Armstrong's executive coach. It's a fantastic, super pragmatic read about building a company.
And last but not least, we got 7 more months of this year. What can we look forward to from Immutable this year?
Well, a lot of games. So even in the next 8 weeks, we have 5 of the blockchain's biggest games launching. The reality is barely any of these have launched still to date. So, I mean, even as we see some of them come out in beta much earlier than we expected, we're seeing sort of hundreds of thousands of users onboarded per week. So expect, Illuvium, Pixelmon, Treeverse, Metalcore, Guild of Guardians, Shardbound, Space Nation. There's an incredible amount of content. We have, I think, 61 games that we're known, tracking, well-funded, releasing in the next 6 months, which is pretty much more than is deployed on every blockchain in the world today combined. So we're pretty excited. We want to make sure they're as successful as possible, their token launches are as successful as possible, and then a host of product stuff where we're just trying to crank at speed and iterate the consumer products to be as frictionless as possible.
That sounds like a jam-packed rest of the year, so congratulations, and hopefully we all get to try some of these games on chain. Thank you, Robbie, and
thanks so much
thanks
for having
everybody.
me.
There you go.